And Australians have been called to vote in a historic referendum on the 14th of October to decide whether to give Indigenous people a voice on policy in Parliament. For more insight on the vote, we're joined now by Hugh Piper. He's Programme Lead of Asia-Pacific Development in the Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, and he's also a Deputy Editor of the Policymaker at James Martin Institute for Public Policy. Good evening to you, Mr. Piper. Previous Australian governments, they've been reconsidering models of Indigenous input into policy making for some decades now, since the 70s. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says that voting on this proposal, it could change the country, in his words, for the better. How optimistic is the yes camp, though, that the country is actually going to vote along those lines?
I think the yes camp are quietly confident that we're going to see a positive result in, just over 6 weeks' time. I think it's a really fantastic opportunity to, in the first instance, recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of this land, but then also, secondly, put in place a really practical model for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Indigenous voices to be at the forefront and right in the middle of policy making in this country, because for far too long, Aboriginal voices have been marginalised in policies and decisions that affect their lives on an everyday basis. And the thing that we've seen as a result of that is more than 200 years of discrimination, injustice and dispossession. And this is a small step towards rectifying that.
If the vote is yes, Mr. Piper, if it were to function correctly without perhaps being slapped down by legal issues, by sort of questions about the Constitution, how far might the voice have the potential to actually significantly impact Australia's future? I mean both socially and economically, and in a positive way.
Yeah, I think it can have a really profound effect right across the board. The voice in and of itself is not a policy solution to, inequality, to, debts in custody that Indigenous people face. But it's better to think of it as a kind of meta solution. It's a way of ensuring that the perspectives, the lived experience of Indigenous people is at the forefront of all of those individual, policy decisions. In a practical sense, that'll mean better and longer lives for Indigenous people. It'll mean less money wasted on, programs that are essentially not working. And, on an international scale, I'd say that it will vastly improve Australia's reputation and standing in the world. Australia's treatment of its Indigenous people has long been a kind of a sore point for Australia's, human rights record and its international reputation. This can only help improve that.
Talk to me about the political risk for Anthony Albanese's government here, though, Mr. Piper, because this referendum has been widely politicised, especially by opposition parties in the country. They say that public support may have even declined for it. There are certain polls, we don't know how accurate they are, that support may have been swayed in some way. These opponents actually say that the referendum may even divide Australians along racial lines. What's the actual danger, though, of that happening?
So, look, I think any referendum like this, it's a momentous decision for a government to undertake. This is the first one that Australia has had since 1999. So the government has obviously staked a huge amount of its credibility in its first term in office, deciding to take a question like this to the Australian people. So there is a risk at stake for the government here in doing so. In fact, it was the first thing that the Prime Minister promised to do after he was declared the winner of the election in May last year. In terms of that point around, I guess, it being a divisive thing, I would characterise that as a negative tactic of the No campaign, trying to claim that this somehow carves Australians into, two classes of people somehow, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I think if you look at the actual reality of the inequality, the dispossession, the injustices that so many Aboriginal people in this country have experienced and continue to experience for so long, this is a step towards actually bringing and closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and making us Australians closer to being one rather than splitting us in two.
Mr. Piper, thank you very much for those thoughts. Hugh Piper there, joining us live from Sydney.